I was going to comment on Trevor's point about the definition of the horse. I was recalling Abraham Maslow, who you may know from the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but he had a great book
yeah.
about he called it, I think it was religion, values, and peak experiences, where he talks about it's a critique of the different movements in psychology in the 1960s, and he talks about how on the one hand you have the psychoanalysts who love to reduce things to the abstract. So they'll talk about things in terms of drives and instincts, and it's all very wishy-washy and imprecise. But he also critiques the behaviorists who, in some sense, maybe the sort of the legacy of the Tom Gradgrins of the world. And he accuses them not of reduction to the abstract, but reduction to the concrete. And he was saying that they can fixate on details to the point where they lose the actual picture of what they're describing. And so you see that kind of nicely in the book, where the guy who goes on to work in the bank, I think student number 11 or whatever he was, he describes a horse in a way that is all factually correct, but it doesn't actually lead you to imagine a horse. Like you could study off all the facts he gives and they're all correct, but again, they don't lead to any understanding of what a horse is. All it does is actually cause more confusion.
Yes,
so Maslow's.
Yes. Bitzer is that character's name. Absolutely, yes.
One of the things I was struck by reading the book, I thought it was very similar to Crime and Punishment, which we're going to be doing the week after next, in a strange way. Because obviously it's in many ways a lot less gloomy than Crime and Punishment, although that's maybe debatable. But it kind of, I felt like the books were very similar in that they showed us kind of, I guess, the failure of a very modern theory. Tom Gradgrin's educational theory versus Raskolnikov's theory of the Superman or the Übermensch, or I don't know what you'd call Raskolnikov's theory, but I think I actually looked into it. Supposedly Dostoevsky was an admirer of Dickens, and there was a rumor that was going around for a while that they actually had met once, but apparently that was shown to not be true. But I think it is accepted that Dostoevsky was read some of his Dickens works. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I wouldn't have put them together in my head beforehand, but supposedly there was some influence there.
Yeah, very. I did not know that. Very, very fascinating. No, for sure. No, and the development of Raskolnikov I find to be eminently darker than Gradgrind. I mean, there's this at some level. I do see the points that Dickens is trying to make about the Industrial Revolution and about confused or wrong-headed notions of child psychology and child rearing. But Gradgrind seems to be a particularly, I don't know, facts, and then the definition of a horse. It seemed over the top. But I mean, I guess as one does in that genre of writing. But whereas Raskolnikov, one of my classmates in high school, he became very, very dark and very. I mean, I think is much more enrapturing psychologically. One can sort of begin to feel enclosed into Raskolnikov. I found the Dickens. I thought Dr. Sugrue's lecture was magnificent and really wonderful, Dr. Sugrue, and yet in rereading Hard Times, it seemed, I don't know, curiously, it just seemed it wasn't exactly my cup of tea. Whereas Crime and Punishment is deeply, deeply disturbing and much more perhaps my cup of tea, but.
I really love Crime and Punishment.
Yeah.
I actually I recently got there's a newer Penguin translation by Oliver Reedy, and I liked it a lot more than the the one I'd read in high school, which was PVR and Volkonsky. Obviously, everyone's mileage varies, but I don't know what Sugrue is reading, Professor Sugrue, but I would probably listen to him first.
Very much. Yeah, I'm just about to begin classes here at my small university, and so I'm not really sure I'm going to get to reread Crime and Punishment for our final meeting. But next week we're discussing Nietzsche and Der Fröhliche Wissenschaft, the gay science, and that I am excited for as well.
Oh yeah.
That's
When was it? 1850?
1854.
Yes. Yes,
yeah.
I see now. Yes.
Yeah. Gosh. Tonicorn, what a wonderful question. The answer to which is I don't know. Gosh.
I know Dickens was immensely popular.
Yes, I think people here have mentioned Harare's *Sapiens* book, and I was just re-looking at a passage in that book about the rise of the agricultural revolution, in which Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, discusses how workers in agriculture really, toil at the earth in ways that hunter-gatherers do not have to toil as intensively, and in some measures have, he seems to indicate, a better life. And yet, that said, the agricultural revolution gave rise to an explosion of wealth and population in ways that hunter-gathering society, I don't think, could have. And I say that too with regard to the Industrial Revolution. It certainly is the case that one of my degrees is in comparative British and American labor history. And so the period about which Dickens is writing, In Hard Times, is something that I have spent some time in my life studying. And it is absolutely true. The grinding of the faces of the poor is something terrible from the Industrial Revolution. And I don't know, maybe that's enough. But there's also a consequence of the astonishing rise in wealth and science and technology at the same time. Although on the ground in Coketown, the individual lives of those workers in industrial society was absolutely mind-numbingly brutal, repetitive, extremely dangerous, and much more. So I am very sympathetic. Tonicorn, those many words I have just uttered don't answer your question at all. What effect did Dickens' novel have? And in some measures, I guess I don't know what effect it had. I mean, the way that it ends on something of a hopeful note, that Mr. Gradgrind has been transformed, and that Sissy, with her intense humanity, the faith, hope, love, and charity that Dr. Sugrue underscored in his lecture as a foundation for human life and as four Christian virtues. Those things are, I think, very important. But in any event, I'm not sure. I don't know immediately. Yes.
I just want to comment briefly on your point, Tonicorn. I think Dr. Sugrue mentioned that Dickens was widely read and he was very popular in his day. But it'd be interesting to know whether someone like John Stuart Mill would ever, or people of that background would have ever, the utilitarians themselves would have ever actually approached his work, because I'm sure that I could imagine that the majority of people who read Dickens would probably be inclined to agree with him, but it would be interesting to see if he ever had an effect on people who may have come from a different persuasion, and whether he had any kind of tendency to change their views at all. But it could be a difficult question to find evidence for or against, I suppose.
Yes, and I think too, excellent, and I think too, in degree, having sympathetic to the suffering of workers who work on an assembly line and without minimum wage and much more, and without safety guards, who suffer, who are maimed and suffer, whose lives are spoiled in the mines, mills, and factories of the Industrial Revolution. And Dickens is pointing to those people. I don't have an answer for that. I am sympathetic. That said, it is fascinating. What would the alternatives have been? I guess in *Sapiens*, Yuval Harari seems to point to, well, there was hunting and gathering, except that hunting and gathering had its own deficits of starvation and much more, whereas the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, did give rise to massive famines and more, but also supported in its good times much larger populations. I don't know. And I like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. I think I said before that I just last year reread the entirety of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it is a book that inspires me to think about how from private vice comes public virtue, as Bernard Mandeville had said, 70 or so years before Smith published Wealth of Nations. But that is to say that there's, what is the alternative to capitalism? I guess I don't know, and it is I'm stuck on two different things, because on the one hand, the true agony and soulless emptiness and life-crushing sort of work of people on the assembly line in a factory without minimum wage, without safeguards, without unions, without protections of any sort, who suffer and die. That's just horrifying. And yet, I don't really know. There's also an incredible upside to commercial society. That Adam Smith calls it commercial society. Karl Marx will call it capitalism, or Karl Marx's followers will call it capitalism. And so, all in all, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm shedding much light on this, but yes, Tanacourt, thank you, Connor, thank you very much. Yes. Oh my gosh.
I think it's interesting to keep in mind as well. I think Karl Popper made this point back in the 1940s, but the capitalism that Marx was critiquing in Capital and the Communist Manifesto was the capitalism of Charles Dickens's time, and it wasn't the capitalism of the 1940s, and it certainly wasn't the capitalism of the 2020s. And so, when we live in a world where we no longer have children working in coal mines, and we no longer have total disregard for workers' rights in that kind of sense, there's no more Stephen Blackpools to speak of. It could be worth questioning the validity of Marx's critiques of capitalism, because the system seems to have reformed itself in many ways since then. Not to undermine the fact that there could be real issues and they should always be addressed, but at the same time, what we would call capitalism in Dickens's time is certainly different to what we would think of it now.
Yes. No, absolutely. You very nicely said. And I see Samuel having joined us. Samuel, what have you to say?
Hi. Well, it's that I took the great pleasure of reading Das Kapital this year. Well, French translation this time. But what's really missing of Karl Marx is what one could call Donald Trump capitalism. Donald Trump doesn't produce anything, he doesn't own factories, he doesn't even own hotels, but he owns a brand. And it's the same thing for Apple. Apple doesn't own factories. Tesla does. Apple doesn't. Apple has outsourced everything it could to China, but marketing, where its most value is created, that's the state. So you have crazy creative people that make ads, and the ads are what generates most of Apple's profit. And that's something that we didn't have in Karl Marx, because I assume that you have a chair factory and it produces chairs all looking more or less like the other ones. And what you pay, it's the price of labor and the fact that they give you access to it, like that they ship it to one place or the other. And that's the value is transferring the wood into a chair. But now the value, it's not the chair, it's like putting the Trump brand on the chair. And then you can say that I love America because my chair has a couple of letters embroidered on it. And that's why I paid 100% more. And
yes, fascinating. If you I am so delighted to be meeting with you all each week. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm taking notes on what everyone says as I do. And Samuel, thank you. So we move from last week's John Locke's labor theory of value to Samuel, this new idea of the not labor theory of value, not the labor that you invest in making that chair that looks like the other chairs, but rather to remove in this modern Donald Trumpian capitalism, at the Apple Corporation, market capitalization of over $1 trillion, at least it was, and so too, I guess, with Tesla. It's a brand theory of value, not a labor theory of value, but of something like akin to a brand theory of value. There's a book in that, Samuel. Go write it. That's really neat. I have not thought of that before, but it certainly, it does seem that a friend of mine who was moderately, well, it was important in Google, but not one of the early employees at Google. Nonetheless, he said early on that he did not see that the value of Google was going to be in its branding, in its advertising, and that is Samuel, as you said, we have, and this goes back to Connor's point about a real transformation from the mid 19th century, the mid 1800s, and the sort of grinding of the faces of the poor in mines, mills, and factories along the lines that Marx and Charles Dickens are commenting on, observing in their world and commenting on, to a modern world that is at least in the United States, perhaps not for little children in China or Vietnam or in Africa and so forth. One sees horrifying stories about people's labor, including child labor, in places around the world. But I really like it, Samuel. Seriously, a brand theory of value. I mean, it's
yeah, if somebody can write it, they can get
that's right.
with the Nobel Prize of Economics.
Exactly. Very nicely done. Yes, please. Tanakorn beautifully said, "Oh my goodness, yeah, yes, yes, and yes again." Wait a minute now. Wait, I'm sounding like Molly at the end of Ulysses by James Joyce. Yes, I said yes. I will. Yes, the incredibly beautifully said. Yes, from even go as you said, going back to Neolithic times, we humans needing to express ourselves through art and through creativity. And next week, we'll be talking about Nietzsche's book, translated in English into The Joyous Wisdom, or the 1952 or thereabouts translation, when the word gay meant happiness or joyful, the gay science, and that translation has stuck. But in any event, next week we will, Tanakorn next week with Nietzsche is going to take up the very question you ask, I think, from many different perspectives, and beautifully said. I myself, I will probably say again next week, but I took off a semester as an undergraduate because when I began to read Nietzsche, I just had to immerse myself in his writing. I just found it so deeply distressing. As I have mentioned, and you have all been deeply kind to me, but I am from the Roman Catholic Christian tradition, and so upon reading Nietzsche, it was so heart-wrenchingly, intellectually, it just freaked me out. I couldn't do anything else but well, I mean, I had a minimum wage job so I could eat, but otherwise I was reading Nietzsche, and then I went back to university the next semester. But in any event, but in precisely, Tanakorn, in the question that you ask, and I do agree with what you said. When you tell people that you're majoring in the liberal arts or something, they say, "Well, what can you do with that?" In terms of making money and making a living, and that's, of course, making a living is extremely important. I think I muddled along into the middle of my 30s, thinking that I could just read books and study, and it worked out okay in the end, sort of. I guess it did, but still, it's the juxtaposition of the need to eat, and the study of the arts, and the promotion and creation of the arts, and are we humans in our essence artists and creators, and how does that fit in with things? Beautifully said. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, oh my goodness, thank you. Other persons, I see we just have about 5 minutes. Concluding remarks, Trevor?
This is the most tangential of tangential, but I was reminded, with the metaphor of reaping and sowing at some point in this conversation, of E.E. Cummings' anyone lived in a pretty how town, which goes, they sowed their isn't, they reaped their same. Cummings isn't the most straightforward poet, so if English isn't your first language, it might take a couple cracks to really see, the sort of thing he's going for. But the lines that rang out to me, there's some sort of disillusionment that I guess he maybe shares in common with Dickens. It's a reach. Anybody else have something better?
No, wonderful. Thank you very much. That's very cool. Oh, thank you.
Well, I think that in that book of Charles Dickens, the one thing that really speaks to me, like it's still right now, it's somehow a critique of the educational system. It's everything should be oriented towards facts, work, and like something practical. And in the end, going for something practical means an unhappy marriage.
Say more. So, in some measures, let me try to think. Let me speak out loud as I'm thinking. So the notion that a happy life is a life within a family and a happy marriage, human community, right? Beyond, human community in family as an essential quality of a good life, friendship and family. And Samuel, is that along the lines that you're indicating, or you're saying, what are you saying about that, if I have it right?
Well, the consequences of Lisa's education by her father, that's like, look at the actuarial table. Actually, you have a long-lived marriage, and like if he dies, you'll inherit, and like you'll be. It's then it's just like it just destroys. Well, nothing short of destroys her. And also the way she talks. Well, that talk, like the marriage talk, it really feels like it's somehow to people along the autistic or Asperger, line that are like talking about like moving chess pieces on a chessboard. And that's something that now we see quite often in TV shows. It's it's like Lisa is like Spock if Spock didn't have a human mother.
Yes, fantastic. Just so. Yes, I was a fan of that television show in its first runs, so I date myself. But yes, exactly. I thought initially you were saying the opposite, which I'm embarrassed to say I misunderstood you. And yes, I'm in complete agreement. Oh, hey, it's time for us to switch over and speak to Dr. Sugrue, and people can ask about his connection, the Wittgenstein questions, and all the other points that people have made here. I will look forward to talking with you next week. Nietzsche, I'll be very fascinated to hear what you have to say. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Keating.
Thank you.
Good.
Oh my gosh, thank you very, very much, sincerely. Thank you so much.
For Dickens, what is the key to redeeming the industrial order that we live in? Well, part of it's going to the circus. Always do that. Enjoy the circus. He's not calling for unionization. He's not calling for a revolution. He doesn't like either side there.
To open up, put ourselves in each other's shoes.
Yeah, and how do we do? Who's going to help them do that?
People like Sissy Jupe.
Yeah. So Sissy Jupe in real life, in the novel, in real life, yeah. He's got a little bit of if you think about, and it's a very interesting moment of how to put it.
We had just a spectacular conversation about it, and people have questions.
Okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, I'm really glad that you enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that you had a good discussion section. Turn my camera on.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, it was simply fantastic. Maybe your dad is waiting to get in. I'm not sure.
I just got here.
Yeah,
there he is. Yeah. Dr. Sugrue, this is John Ricciuti. We just had a wonderful conversation, and
That's great, isn't it? Wonderful book.
Loved your presentation, sir. Thank you so much.
It's okay, John. I mean, people my daughter's age have to call me sir or doctor. You should just call me Mike.
Yeah, no, indeed, Mike, I can and will. I have lived here in Northeast Ohio for a quarter century, and sir is how people speak. So
Okay, well, look, I understand that.
I imbibed a little.
No,
of that.
I spent time in South Carolina 2 years doing dissertation research, and when I came back to Manhattan, I was sir and ma'am and everybody. And
Yes,
people
sir.
looked at me strangely, but I actually had come to like it.
Yes,
I mean, you don't notice politeness until you've been exposed to it and lost it. But that's just me.
Absolutely. Mike, thank you enormously. I will let others have the floor. Thank you. It was terrific. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you had a good time with this book because, damn, this is a funny book. I mean, it's sad and it's true, but I mean, Dickens is an unjustly neglected writer because the big fat books are so daunting, right? I mean, if you ever look at something like Martin Chuzzlewit or Oliver Twist, I mean, there's a lot of book there. I mean, he's really getting Russian at this point. But you have to remember that he had no money. It was being paid by the word. I'm not making that up. So since it came out as a serial, he was just cranking out plots and subplots and excessive degrees of description of everything more than once. So understandably, maybe this also, like Cervantes or Melville, maybe this needs an editor as well.
And people love the stuff, right? I've read
Well,
that people would stand on the docks in America and wait for the ships to bring over the latest section of Dickens novels, right?
Yeah, I don't blame them. I mean, it's certainly better than just about anything they could find at home. And particularly if it's serialized, you know how if you get to a TV show that you really like, I mean, you know, that time, block it out so we can see it when it's first released. Dickens had that kind of popularity, and actually, I don't blame people. He's a very wise man in a lot of ways. Granted, a little bit romantic and gushy. Maybe we could rein that in a little bit. I mean, we don't have to constantly be weeping or laughing. I mean, there are those intermediate phases of human life. But well, just the fact that Mr. Gradgrind names two of his children, Malthus and Adam Smith. You gotta like that. I mean, come on, the kid's name is Malthus, or Mr. Gradgrind's partner, Mr. McChokumchild. I mean, that's a great thing to think up. I mean, I couldn't think that up if you gave me 10 years. So Mr. McChokumchild is just perfect. There are so many beautiful one-liners, even one-word jokes that, you know, I can't help but stand back and admire. All right. So whatever criticism I have of the guy, he's still really, really good. And I hope that you develop a taste for it as I have. All right. Don't wait for it to come out in some other medium, you know, television or a movie or a play. Dickens is well worth your time, particularly if you're taking one of those long flights to some, you know, other part of the world. I mean, you're not going anywhere anyway. So take something gigantic with you, like one of Dickens's works. They're all great, or not all, but most of them are truly great. So what'd you think? You're supposed to think something.
I was wondering if I could ask you about the popularity of the books. One of the points that was raised in our discussion section was on, I guess, the social impact of Dickens and of Hard Times. And obviously you mentioned that his books were very popular. I was wondering, were they popular all around, or were they popular with a particular social strata? Like, could you imagine someone like John Stuart Mill reading it and enjoying it?
I can imagine John Stuart Mill reading it. Enjoying it is a funny way to put it. If you've ever read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, he didn't enjoy much, right? Even though his father was a monster who stole his childhood from him, and he had real serious mental problems as a result of that, at the end of his autobiography, he endorses the educational regime that he was raised under. And that was really a worry to me. I mean, there's the Stockholm syndrome for you. I won't go into the specifics of John Stuart Mill's autobiography, but that's something well worth reading, particularly for the passage in which he becomes clinically depressed for about 6 months and won't get out of bed, and then is finally liberated from his depression when he reads a book, and it reminds him, perhaps for the first time, that eventually his father is going to die. All of a sudden he's okay and gets out of bed and he's feeling good. Now remember, these are pre-Freudian times. He doesn't know what he's revealing, all right? But he has a real problem with his father, as anybody would, raised as he was. So I don't know if John Stuart Mill would have liked it. He may have approved of it, which would be different, right? I can imagine, though, other writers, particularly romantics, saying, look, this guy's got the touch, right? He can give you genuine pathos. He can give you funny humor, I mean, laugh out loud funny. He can also genuinely make you feel solidarity or identity with at least some of his characters, right? Do you remember when the kids, they're 5, 6 years old and they snuck up to the circus and they're looking up under the tent and they're watching Merrylegs the dog do tricks? Now, first of all, I'm a sucker for any book that has animals with proper names so that they're allowed to be characters, right? I mean, the whale takes Captain Ahab personally. That's pretty crazy, but, I've always found those intriguing books. But Mr. Gradgrind says, up from there, children. I mean, his little, what did he call it? Metallurgical Louisa and his, engineering Tom shouldn't spend their time watching a dog do tricks. And I'm thinking to myself, that's exactly what kids should be spending their time doing. And the fact that they don't have the same interest in metallurgy that you do is a sign that your theory of education is all messed up. Sometimes on my YouTube channel, people will ask me, how do I get my kids to read all the books you have as quickly as possible? I say, don't do that. Let children be children. The joy of children should have childish laughter. Let them watch Merrylegs. It's not bad for them. Trying to force them into that, you end up with John Stuart Mill, who for all his brilliance is also a deeply twisted individual. So don't push your kids so hard as that. Don't worry that they may possibly develop an imagination, right? That's okay. It's not absolutely essential to tell them when they're 5 that there's no Santa Claus. They'll figure it out sooner or later anyway, all right? Let them believe in magical stuff. Let them have, let them have foolishness in their life. There'll be a time later on, as Mr. Fribley knows, when someone will require them to read a bunch of really hard books. But that should not be grammar school, all right? That's an almost certain way to make them hate reading, right? If they take to it naturally, that's different, but don't push it on them. You have to chill when you're trying to help your children out. A sense of proportion is very important. And that's one of the things that Mr. Gradgrind lacks, right? Facts. Well, look, facts are good things, but they're not the only good things. And they're particularly not the only good things for 5-year-olds, right? Knowing the difference between the mind of a child and the mind of an adult is absolutely essential if you don't want to make a mess of children. Right. So, I did my best to push my girls in the direction of learning. And every night when I came to dinner, and, I think it's important to be at dinner if you can as a father, they knew the first thing I was going to ask them was, what did you learn today? Now, they don't have to learn, all right, the formula for gasoline. If they were to learn something like South America is south of North America, or that blue is a very pretty color, I could go with that with a 4-year-old, or that 3 + 2 is 5. That's fine. The only answer that is not acceptable is nothing. All right. The idea is that everybody has a job. Dad has a job, mom has a job, and you have a job. Your job is to learn stuff, and you don't have to learn anything earth-shaking, but you have to learn something. Now, after I did that, I was often known for playing the fool, because when I was playing the fool, I was not just playing. right? So I would, those little carrots that they have that have, the skin taken off them and they're, an inch or two long. It was often the case, much to the disapproval of their mother, that I would put those in my ears and nostrils, turn around to my children, and make all of them laugh, right? And then the question was, which one would laugh so much that they would spit their milk out, which would really get their mother upset. They'll never learn manners, that kind of thing. And they did eventually learn manners, but the idea is playing the fool is not necessarily a bad thing, all right? So Mr. Gradgrind's mistaken conception of human nature leads to a mistaken theory of education, and that's the first third of the book, the sowing, right? Second third is the reaping, and then the garnering. All right, well, this is what it leads to. So my view is that education is the most important political issue. It's more important than war or economics or race or any of that stuff. Education determines what the next generation is going to look like. And if you fail to give them a proper education, that may be unrecoverable, right? If the economy goes into recession, you can fix that. It's cyclical. Education is not. Oh, and also, before I go, Evan, I got your email, but I haven't been feeling well. I'm sorry I haven't got back to you, but I will try. All right, who has a question?
No problem. Thank you.
Come on, you got to have some kind of question.
So what do you think the utilitarian social reformers whom Dickens was parroting would have said in response to this?
Well, they would have said this is a caricature. Well, they would have said this is a caricature.
Yeah.
And it is. But the problem is that a fair number of these guys were very extreme. For example, John Stuart Mill and his father, the elder Mill, used to have Bentham over for dinner fairly frequently. And John Stuart Mill, like Kierkegaard, incidentally, which made him crazy too, used to sit down with the adults and talk about adult things when he was a kid.
Yeah.
And of course, none of these guys put carrots in their ears.
Yeah, and they,
right?
As I remember his autobiography, they specifically forbade him from playing with other children so that he could learn Latin and Greek.
Well, one of the lines in the autobiography, which is truly terrifying, he says, "I cannot remember a time when I could not read Greek."
I remember that. Yeah.
What that means, back to his earliest memories of childhood, he was already able to read Greek. Look, it damn near killed me to learn to read Greek at a much later age. Doing that to a 3-year-old is a terrible idea. And it's not that reading Greek is bad. It's that 3-year-olds locked on a table across from their father, overwhelming all day, every day, cruising through his Greek was a really bad idea. So, poor John Stuart Mill is an example of what Dickens is talking about, that the utilitarians don't have a sense of proportion. They claim that they can solve all problems in morals and legislation. I think that they're overselling a good idea. In other words, it matters how you deploy scarce resources, right? Because we have an infinite set of wants and we have a finite set of resources with which to satisfy those wants. So it's better for us to spend $1 billion researching COVID than researching a disease, a genetic disease that only affects half a dozen people. Why? Well, because COVID has killed millions of people and it's well worth directing the money in that direction. The problem is it's been oversold. It solves some of our problems some of the time, but not all of our problems all of the time. Regrettably, as far as I can tell, there is no silver bullet that solves all our problems when considering right and wrong and political choices. So the greatest good for the greatest number deserves a place in our toolkit for thinking about such matters, but you need to have the techne. You need to have the phronesis that allows you to know, like a carpenter knows what you do with a hammer and what you do with a saw. You're supposed to know what tool you need for the job, right? And that Mr. Gradgrind doesn't understand. And the result of it is lampooned beautifully. So I think that for the most part, the British utilitarians were right. I mean, they're the ones who were behind the repeal of the Corn Laws, which allowed grain to come in from the outside, which reduced the cost of bread to working people, which was a big deal. They were also behind the extension of the franchise in 1832, 1867, and 1844, which prevented a French Revolution type explosion. So that was a smart thing to do. Try and create the greatest good for the greatest number and do it gradually, right? That's wise. Trying to get everything done, forcing it into this utilitarian mold, doesn't work if you try and get everything done all at once. All right. Mr. Garner.
Yeah, I was wondering, I've only read 2 of Dickens' novels now, but one of them, the first one, Great Expectations, had a profound impact. It was the one that awakened me to literature. So
I just.
Oh, you're still here.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I can hear you, but I can't see anybody.
Oh.
Perhaps that's just as well. I don't know.
Well, yeah. Let me know if you can't hear me. I guess my
okay. So you read 2 of Dickens's novels.
2 of Dickens's novels. One of them had a profound impact on me. Great Expectations. I read it twice in my life, and so it's a work of art for me. I accept that, but okay. My question is, it seems like he keeps using a lot of these same sorts of tropes of characters. The blustery man, Jaggers seems very similar to Bounderby in some ways, but not totally. And then these kind of Ice Queen women, Estella versus Louisa. Like, is there something that we know that he's drawing from deeper, either in his own life? I'm not trying to psychoanalyze the guy, but why does he keep kind of going to these generalized characters and playing, a mashup of them and playing with them?
That's actually a very well thought out question. Here's the deal, right? Dickens, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dickens is primarily a comedian. Remember that I said a couple of times that I think that comedy is cognitive. Well, here's the deal. Both epic and tragedy are about individuals. They're about particular people individuated in a particular way. So, for example, the tragedy of Hamlet, all right, could not be retitled The Overcautious Oedipal Young Man, because he's not an example of an overcautious Oedipal young man. He is Hamlet, and Hamlet is a specific individual. Same sort of thing with Oedipus. You can't say the regrettably blind, incestuous father brother, because, again, he's not an example of a type. He's specifically Oedipus. But think about something like, what could I get? Think about Moliere. There's a great comedian. What are his plays called? The Miser, the Misanthrope, the Imaginary Invalid, or the Hypochondriac. These are types of people. So comedy is about types. Tragedy is about individuals. So you'll find, if you look particularly at Roman comedy, people like Terence or Plautus, it's the same stock dozen or so characters that get recycled again and again. There's the saucy slave that knows better than the master. There's the master that doesn't know what's going on. There's the young couple who have been somehow separated but are going to find a way to get reunited. And they don't die at the end like Romeo and Juliet. So what I'd be inclined to say is that Dickens' novels, because they're primarily comic novels, are about types of people. Think of Mr. Micawber. He's the optimist that's never going to get anywhere. Something will turn up. The closest we get to individuation is somebody like Mr. Fleary with his speech impediment. I also really like that little bit of characterization. I think that goes a long way. But the nasty blowhard, we're going to find plenty of those outside of Mr. Boundary.
Right.
The poor, sad child. Well, we get that in Oliver Twist. Please, sir, I want some more. But we're also going to get that in A Christmas Carol with Tiny Tim. Who cannot feel bad about Tiny Tim? If Mr. Scrooge doesn't learn how to be kind, Tiny Tim will die. But if Mr. Scrooge changes his ways, Tiny Tim can laugh and be with us, and at the end he'll say, God bless us, everyone. So the pitiful child, again, Dickens uses that again and again, like the cruel blowhard, right? Think of Mr. Scrooge, highly comparable to Mr. Bounderby. Think of Oliver Twist, comparable to, well, the most pitiful creature in the novel is Louisa, whose life and psyche is destroyed by this education.
Yeah, I get it. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I don't mind it any more than I don't mind seeing the same characters recycled on, I guess, Saturday Night Live if I want to be lowbrow about it.
That's exactly right. Comedy is about types of people, right? I mean, how many different variations are there on the idiot politician? Right? I mean, look, most politicians are very satisfactory objects of satire and lampooning. There are only a very few of them that are so austere and grave that you don't make jokes about that. I can see making jokes about Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden. It's harder for me to imagine making jokes about George Washington. I mean, he was a serious guy.
Yeah.
All right. What else?
Well, as I was discussing with James, I thought the book characters were like black or white. There was no complexity. The characters. It's very simple and very humorous book. But he portrayed all the rich people as bad, and Stephen Blackpool, Rachel, they're all poor, and he portrays them as very good character. I agree with Mr. Garner. Like Dickens' books are more like that. David Copperfield, Oliver Twist. Like it's all the poor. They come up to succeed in life, and they have very good characters, and the rich are shown as very bad.
Okay, a couple of things. First off, yeah, I think that Dickens, for the most part, is trying to be a moral educator. In other words, he's trying, the traditional justification for comedy was that it holds vice up to ridicule. And people can deal with being disapproved of, but hardly anybody can cope with being laughed at. On the other hand, you're also right that this is a long way from somebody like Dostoevsky, in which the interior psychic events are overwhelmingly important, and they, in some ways, drown out the external activities, with the exception possibly of murdering old people with an axe. On the other hand, there are always a couple of exceptions, which prevent it from being straight ahead propaganda. For example, think about who is it? Slackbridge, right? He's the socialist agitator. He's poor, but he's an even man. He's the one who accuses Stephen Blackpool of turning his back on the working class and not showing solidarity. And he is as cruel as the wealthy characters, but he spreads his cruelty in a different fashion because of his social class. On the other hand, think about, I forget the guy's name, the one who saves David Copperfield when he's brought in front of the judge. That's a nice rich man who felt bad for David Copperfield, or rather, and Oliver Twist too is another one I forget the name of. There's so many characters in Dickens, it's hard to keep them straight. But you occasionally see the good rich person. You occasionally see the bad poor person. Think of somebody like Stephen Blackpool's wife, who's a wretch, right? She's a chronic drunk and makes his life miserable. So it's not that rich people are bad and poor people are good, but rather there's a tendency for the people with advantages to become hard-hearted. And when they when they cease to have sympathy for other people, that's the beginning of their end morally. So there's a danger in great wealth, and that danger lies in the fact that it insulates you from other people's misery. It doesn't mean that that evil and good are restricted to those social classes, but it means that there's a tendency for it to work out that way. Okay, what else?
Okay, so I have a question from Peter, and his question is: nature is to Dickens and romanticism in general. So nature is to romanticism as what is to us today. And he said he'll give you the answer. The answer is unplugging, disconnecting from our technology.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in some ways that is a return to nature. Right. In other words, the only way you're going to be able to successfully unplug is not just to unplug your computer and throw away your cell phone. You're going to have to live in a monastery, or maybe on your own, on some mountaintop. Right. Even people that are largely resistant to technology can't help but have it seep in one way or another. I would have said nature is to romanticism as society is to us today. In other words, it's the great other, and society constructs various kinds of illusory ideals. Can you see, is there a problem?
I think Genevieve's
I
mic
do
is
hear
on.
something, as maybe someone's mic is on and TV is
Yeah,
on.
okay. Okay, my point is I would have chosen society rather than unplugging, right? Because with the vogue of social constructivism, that everything, all the structures populating our consciousness are created by society in its historical development, so that we have these categories and structures forced upon us, and we mistake them for being natural and real. I think that that's something that we may well want to resist, but we also may well want to resist the idea that all the structures in our mind are socially constructed, right? I think that that's been taken much too far. So I think that would have the position that nature does for the romantics. But remember that Professor Field really knows what he's talking about when it comes to romanticism. He writes about that stuff and knows an awful lot about it. So let's defer to him and assume that he's right. All right, so I gave the second best answer. What else?
He also said, is Dickens, I think, therefore I feel.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Tempted to reverse it. I feel, therefore I think. That the problem with Mr. Gradgrind is not that he doesn't think, it's that he thinks without balancing it out with ordinary human emotion. Remember when he proposes the arranged marriage to Louisa between his daughter and, of all people, the 30 years older Mr. Bounderby, and he brings her statistics showing that such a marriage is probably going to be successful. Here's a father who loves his daughter, but hasn't really stopped to think about what love implies, what it entails. And he thinks without plugging in the emotional half of his psyche. That happens at the end, and I'm so happy that we get, at least in the case of Mr. Mr. Gradgrind, a happy solution. Remember that he ends up going to Parliament, which is where most of the utilitarians wanted to end up so they could do something useful. And he gives up on statistics and facts, and instead talks about benevolence and charity and Christian virtue. So he's a soul that gets saved. And he doesn't get saved by reason. He gets saved by wholesome emotion. Does that make sense? I can't see you still, so I can't tell how quizzical you are about these responses.
It makes sense.
Go ahead.
I actually, to sort of add on to that, I actually I would have said the exact same thing. I feel, therefore I think. I have a saying in thinking about this kind of stuff. I was thinking reason is the handmaiden of faith. And in this case, I would say reason for Dickens would be the handmaiden of feeling. You reason within the realms of what you feel. You start with feeling. And this harkens back to some of the things you were saying with education, that we teach children, or we should endeavor to teach children, emotional things first.
Yes.
And then reason can come along and help actualize the things that might be spurred on by our emotional tendencies or what we believe.
That's a good point. If you remember Hume, who said that reason is the slave of the passions, well, he takes it pretty far, right? But what he says is that reason can tell you the means by which you achieve things, but that the ends you want to achieve are determined by your passions. Well, I won't get embroiled in a Kant-Hume dispute here, but I would be inclined to say and agree with you that children learn to feel before they learn to reason, right? And so the best things to teach, or the best ways to teach children, are with stories. For example, I guess I told you about when I was teaching my daughters to write, when they're still very little and they have those big red pencils, because their fingers are so small. I used to have them copy out verses from the book of Proverbs, because it says stuff like God likes ants because they work really hard. And then I would take them out and put a few breadcrumbs on an anthill and watch these little ants try and drag those gigantic bread. The little ant works and it never gives up. It keeps on working. And if it keeps on working, a couple of his friends come by and eventually they pull the breadcrumb into the anthill and everybody has dinner that night and everybody is happy. You see what a good idea it is to be like the ant. And you see why God likes ants. And they would catch on to that. Also, you can teach them things like Aesop's fables. That's a good place to start. The tortoise and the hare, right? Not a bad choice. Also something, the Christian parables can be understood by a 6-year-old. Think of something like the Good Samaritan. Talk about a man being beaten up and hurt and crying and being left in the road. Children know what it's like to fall and cry and be left. And then say, 2 people didn't help him, but 1 person did. Jesus says he likes the person that helped him. What do you think about that? And they will 100% of the time say, I like the idea of helping people that are hurt. And I say, well, you picked up on the right answer, and that's the right understanding of this thing. Can you see why God likes people that help other people? Now, later on, all right, I'll give them the categorical imperative. But 6 years old is not the time for that. All right? Now, just show them how to have sympathy for other people. Now, just show them the advantages of diligence. And show them the advantages of teamwork with those ants all working together to pull in the giant breadcrumb. All of those can be taught to children without overwhelming their rational capacities, right? Mr. Gradgrind doesn't see that. And that's why, some of the exchanges with Sissy Jupe are so funny. Do you remember when they talk about the definition of a horse? And it turns out she knows perfectly well what a horse is, but can't give us an essential definition of it. And she says she would like a carpet that has flowers and horses on it because she thinks it would be beautiful. And he says, no, you never see horses and flowers on the floor in the real world. So you shouldn't have them on a wall or a floor. Instead, in Mr. Gradgrind's home, which is called Stone Lodge, he has mathematical formulas on the wall. Right? Facts, facts, facts. Feelings are educated as well as rational capacities. And I might be tempted to say that the reason we teach literature is to educate people's imagination. Right?
If I could just jump in.
Go ahead.
Well, I had 2 things I wanted to say. One of them is just keep that in mind. The Sissy Jupe knows what a horse is, but cannot give a definition of it. Keep that in mind when you read my email. But the second thing that I wanted to say was I would almost be tempted to say, or to wonder if maybe this might be what Jesus meant when he says, anyone who does not accept the kingdom of heaven as a little child will never enter it. I'm paraphrasing there, but
there's much to think about there. You're right. It's an enigmatic statement, but that's as good a gloss as I've ever heard. There's a lot of truth that gets said by children and idiots, right? No, I mean, children haven't learned to properly self-censor. So sometimes, when I go and, when I used to go and see, parent-teacher night, used to go and, talk to other people or talk to teachers. One of my daughters might pipe up and say, Daddy thinks she's a real bitch. And I'm thinking, dear God, please, child, don't look at her. And in a few years, she'll understand that she's not supposed to inform people of what Daddy says. But children will say things because they don't self-censor, because they are without guile, right? So there's something to be said for that. But on the other hand, we need more than that, all right? If you're completely without guile, you're going to end up as Dostoevsky's idiot, right? Who actually is Jesus. And there's a great line in that novel where some horrible criminal character says to the idiot, Pierre, I can't figure out if you're really smart or really stupid. And that is true of sometimes the insights that children have and articulate. So you're right. Do not underestimate the insights of children. On the other hand, do not leave them with just those insights, or perhaps things that shouldn't be said will get said. One of the things you should also consider is that the Bible says that the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. And much as I like the Bible, I don't believe that. I think the beginning of wisdom is learning how to keep your mouth shut. If you consider how many of problems are caused by talking when you shouldn't, rather than failing to talk when you should, you'll realize that 90% of the problems come from talking when you shouldn't. So learning how to hold your tongue is an adult virtue, and children will have to be taught that, despite the bad effects it might have on their innocence. What else? Yeah. All right. Art requires technique, so it can't be purely random. All right. Art also requires intentionality, so it can't be completely irrational. But art requires a novel transformation of what we see ordinarily in every day. So if you think about some of the bad characters in Hard Times, think about Bitzer, his utilitarian calculation when concluding that helping his old teacher out and not condemning his son to be hanged, or not condemning Mr. Gradgrind's son to be hanged, doesn't matter as much to him as getting a reward and possibly a promotion from the bank at which he works. Now, here we have the result of a one-sided education in just rationality. And Tom, Louise's brother, is another such example who takes a different but equally pernicious path. The proper education of a human being requires that you educate their entire mind. So you're going to show them things like the times tables and how mathematics works and geometry, but you're also going to allow them to express themselves either by making up stories or by drawing pictures. And that development of their imagination is at least equally important to the development of their rationality, right? Both of them will lead to badly formed human beings. Does that help you? All right. So, I think that art says things that philosophers often can't say, or at least if they can say it, philosophers say it after the artists have already said it. I think, was it Byron who said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world? Well, I think there's an awful lot of truth in that. If you look at the characteristic art forms of a given society, you will see the rational thinking of that time and the time immediately that's going to immediately follow it, prefigured in the things that people treat as worthy works of art. Okay, what else?
So I think both Dickens and Karl Marx were both living in London around the same time in the 1850s.
Yeah.
There's obviously some ideological overlap there in the, outrage at the harsh conditions of factory workers and child labor, also, the gap between rich and poor. But obviously, there's probably some a large disagreement about them about what the right reaction to that would have been. So do you know if they ever interacted with one another or read each other?
I don't know. I really don't. It would be a fascinating conversation, but I imagine that it would be a short conversation because they would find it hard to agree on the background beliefs which informed their view of the world. Dickens spent his time reading people like Jane Austen and reading people like Charlotte Bronte and reading people like William Blake. Marx spent his time reading Hegel, right? And of course, Hegel, those will have very different influences on the way people think. Second of all, I think there's a certain sort of anger and how can I put it? An unquenchable anger in Marx that's not there in Dickens. Dickens is angry, but he thinks people are reclaimable, right? Look at what happens to Mr. Gradgrind. Marx thinks that people whose hearts have been hardened by their position as owners and masters, that they're going to have to be done away with. So I think that there's more forgiveness of human frailty, where Marx is going to be much more active and proactive, that people that are bad have to be killed, not merely
Yep. So more like a Madame Defarge view of the world.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yep.
What else?
Industrial capitalism seems to not be going. And if it does an okay job, it's totally debatable, but if it does okay at allocating investment capital and towards producing goods and services that lots of people need, a huge case can be made that it doesn't do well at all. I think Dickens points out its impotence with regard to human capital and natural capital, the environment.
Yeah, okay. That's a very good point. There's a very short novel. I don't know the occasion for it because Dickens didn't usually write short pieces, but it's 75 pages or so, called The Mudfog Papers. And it's about something like Coat Town, which is where hard times occurs. Everything's covered with soot. It's filthy and nature has been destroyed. I think you're right. We've made a Faustian bargain with the division of labor. We get more things, and for the first time, that creates the possibility not the reality, but the possibility of abolishing human scarcity. And I think that's a really, I mean, I'm actually proud of that. The two great achievements of the West so far are the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of women. I think it's not impossible to imagine 100 years from now that productive capacities have been so increased that we can put food on everybody's table and a roof over everybody's head. So I think that the abolition of scarcity, if it ever occurs, would only occur through the effective allocation of capital. And for that, you need private property and capitalism. So one of the things that they used to say in the Soviet Union before it collapsed was that after the global proletarian revolution, we're going to have to keep one country that's still capitalist, because that'll be the only way for us to know how to set prices. A price is a kind of information, and it gives you real-time quantifiable information about the demand for goods and what the most effective way to allocate capital is. The problem is, and without that, you don't know how to price things. On the other hand, while you can find a way of pricing things effectively, it does not sufficiently concern itself with externalities. And what you get is the tragedy of the commons. Everybody's willing to throw their garbage into the commons, the atmosphere and the ocean. Particulate, I mean, think of the Beijing Olympics. They actually had to close down all the factories within 50 kilometers because the athletes couldn't breathe. And of course, after the Olympics, they started them all up again. But even though they have laws against pollution, because there's so much corruption and money being paid under the table, if you pay off the right people, you can get around those regulations. Air it's the equivalent of smoking half a pack of cigarettes every day if you're in one of those major industrial cities. Their air pollution is so bad that some of the particulate matter actually falls in California. Same sort of thing with the garbage patch in the Pacific. Everybody says, why don't we just toss our crap in the ocean? Well, the problem is that the ocean is finite, and you have to find some way of regulating the commons. Both the air and the water deserve protection. The problem is how to implement that and then make it effective. That's by no means easy. But I'm not sure that abolishing capitalism and abolishing the price mechanism is a smart way to do that. That seems to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. On the other hand, the critics of capitalism that say we have problems with the destruction of nature are absolutely right. The question is how to allocate the costs of protecting nature.
Thank you.
Sure. What else?
I wanted to ask, are characters so recycled / archetypical from, I believe this is the pulp fiction genre? When people were paid by, like, just because, they need to be loud because they know people will, excuse me, people will just ignore a large section of the book trying to get through it. And was that typical of authors of that genre? And like, were Dickens' contemporary also writing stereotypes that loud?
Yes. Let me give you an example. A romantic novel that was very widely read, was very popular, and as a work of art is just awful. Uncle Tom's Cabin. I don't know if you've ever read that, but because I studied American history, it was one of the things I had to pay my dues and read through. And what it is a collection of symbols pretending to be people. There's mischief maker Liza. She's the mischievous slave. That actually goes back to the saucy slave of Plautus among the Romans. There's Uncle Tom, who is an Uncle Tom. The fact that you can become an Uncle Tom shows you that he's not a character, that he's a type. There's Simon Legree, the bad slave owner who wants to make people unhappy just because he can make people unhappy. He's evil for evil's sake. These are a far cry from the very complicated psychological portraits you get in somebody like Dostoevsky or Flaubert. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was an extremely popular novel. It was historically very influential, but it's a dreadful work of art. And you know, the pathetic scenes of the dying slave and the cruel master chasing them with bloodhounds. It's a tearjerker, but it has the how can I put it? It has the sensibility of a soap opera, right? Which are just one thing after another. You know, one betrayal, one destruction, one I don't know. Soap operas perhaps twice a year have someone get amnesia. If you see what I'm saying, you have to plug in all kinds of stereotypical devices to get people to watch those. It doesn't mean that some of them can't rise out of that genre, for better and for worse. I would think of something like Quentin Tarantino. He had a movie called Pulp Fiction. And yes, it was Pulp Fiction. It was enormously popular. And yes, I think it's a work of art, but I think it's a really depraved work of art. The problem I have with Pulp Fiction is that it's about the banality of evil. Evil is everywhere. Every time you turn your head, there's some enormous horror going on there. And that's the portrait he's creating for contemporary LA. Now, maybe contemporary LA really is like that, but it's the unrelieved pessimism and the cheap shots that he takes all the time. So, I mean, I admire Quentin Tarantino because he really can get your emotions going, but I think that the moral implication, and I think all art has moral implications, the moral implications are deeply disturbing, right? There's no salvation for anyone, unlike Mr. Gradgrind, who learns his lesson and turns over a new leaf. In Pulp Fiction, one character is worse than the other, and there's no rhyme or reason anywhere. That's people. You might think that that's also true occasionally of Cormac McCarthy, but there I think that there's actually a moral order there. It's just that sometimes the moral order lapses into chaos. If you think about the book and the movie, No Country for Old Men, the ending is so puzzling and strange, right? Here we have this murderer who goes through murdering dozens of people for frivolous and not so frivolous reasons. And then out of nowhere, his car gets hit by another car, and that's the end of him, implicitly. Well, there's no moral order there either. And I worry about a moral vacuum that's to be found in any work of art, right? It's not that it isn't perhaps evocative, it may well be, but to create emotionally evocative art that leaves us in a moral darkness that doesn't show us any way out, I think that that's actually harmful to society. And here I'm showing my inner Platonist again.
So, just to speak up briefly in defense of Quentin Tarantino, I agree with what you said about Pulp Fiction, perhaps there being a little moral nihilism there. But if you look at a more mature work like Django Unchained, which is about slavery, I think there you see more of a moral compass.
You do, but everything is a wildly extended caricature, right? I mean, that's intended to be as offensive as possible to contemporary audiences. This is not to apologize for slavery, but it's to point out what Dickens himself saw, that there were good and bad people on both sides of the divide. Rich people that have advantages, are often hard-hearted because of it, but not all of them are. Think about something like The Hateful Eight, right? I mean, everybody's bad here.
That's nihilistic, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in other words, every time you find out more about these people, they sink further and further into the nihilistic muck. And at the end, everybody's dead, and it's kind of a relief.
Yeah.
So I admire Quentin Tarantino. For me, it's a guilty pleasure. For me, Quentin Tarantino is the modern analog of Euripides. right? And I mean, think of Medea, right? Does she really have to kill both her children during the play? I mean, maybe we could have found some other way of doing this.
And escape punishment by Deus Ex Machina, right?
Right. Or think about the Bacchae. Let's have a bunch of crazy women go out and let's have a mother tear her son apart. Everybody can eat him and she can come back with his head thinking that he's a lion. Okay. I'm not 100% sure that we need that level. And look, even artists that I have the greatest respect for, like Shakespeare, in King Lear, is it absolutely essential that Gloucester has his eyes gouged out on stage? Could we not have done that somewhere else? No, we got to get it here. And believe me, it's an arresting scene where Gloucester gets his eyes torn out vile jelly, and everybody freezes up. But sometimes I think that the ability of certain artists to get emotional reactions gets the better of them. And they lose sight of the bigger picture, and in some cases are the prisoners of their own ability.
Yep.
Just regarding like the historical viewpoint, I just want to ask one more time. Were books enjoyed individually like then? Because I know when you describe Don Quixote, it's basically the innkeeper has one big tome and he reads a section of it.
Right.
Like,
we got to remember 1605, the first volume of Don Quixote. In Spain, very few people can read.
Yeah.
By the time we get to Hard Times, 1854, the majority of the English middle class and a fair number of the working class are literate, which creates the demand for these serialized stories. And they are read widely rather than by one person reading it out loud. So we haven't completely made the jump from a pre-literate to a literate society in Cervantes, but we're fully there when we get to Dickens.
okay. So it doesn't just look wordy because it's been adapted, recollected like 400 times over the last 100 years, and like we're getting it as one big fat thing all at once.
Well, that's what we get. What they got was a chapter or two chapters every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever the rate of the periodical was. So Dickens used to be he was worse than any undergraduate you've ever met, trying to get something in before a deadline, right? He's got to get these things written. He needs a certain number of words, and it has to be at the printers tomorrow. So he, rips things off, gets them out, and then afterward, he has the copyright, so he's allowed to form them as books and then make money off the copyrighted novel that's complete.
Okay, thank you for explaining the historical
That's the way his novels work. It's also the way Dostoevsky's novels work, strangely enough. Right? They were originally serialized and then put together by Dostoevsky. And he used to write at the last minute, getting things off. At a certain point, he even stopped writing and started dictating his novels. Get them to the printer that much faster.
I see.
What else?
So thinking about art, I had a passage from this reading. It's a really short quote. I was hoping to quote it and comment about art through it. And it's so Gradgrin talking to Lou, and he says, "I never knew you were unhappy, my child." And she responds, "Father, I always knew it. In this strife, I have almost repulsed and crushed my better angel to a demon. What I have learned has left me doubting, misbelieving, despising, regretting what I have not learned. And my dismal resource has been to think that life would soon go by and that nothing in it could be worth the pain and trouble of a contest." And so that passage is absolutely heartbreaking to me. And, I get a little misty-eyed when I read it. And so I'm moved. I think about art, and what occurs to me is maybe I'm in left field, but something emerges from this that's not contained in the text. Like the text outlines something, and there's something else that comes out of it. And I'm calling this in essence, and I think about art. I think about in that science will particularize something. With our reason, we particularize, whereas aesthetics kind of engages with something. Your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. That's a beautiful passage. I mean, it's beautiful because it's wrenching. It sounds like she's describing. Of course, they didn't have that back then, but they had melancholy, and that's what she is. And the reason why she's melancholy is because her father's misunderstanding of human nature caused him to give her a bad education, and the result of a bad education is a broken adult. And the decisions that he made were also the product of that misunderstanding of human nature. And so she has lost all reason to live. And her indictment of her father is not out of unkindness, but it's something that needs to be said, that she has finally gotten to the point where she can say it. If I remember correctly, the next thing she does is swoon away. And her life is uncertain. You know, it's despaired of. We don't know if she's going to live or die. But art at its high points, or at its high point, is often something specific that gestures at something universal, right? Think of Michelangelo's Pietà with Mother Mary holding the body of her dead son. Well, parental sorrow is represented by that piece of marble in an extraordinarily universal way, but the marble itself is only too particular. Not only can art gesture at human nature, it can also gesture at human possibility, which means that, for example, Mr. Gradgrind, although he is forever burdened, I'm confident, with his mistakes in raising his children, is not consigned to a living hell. He can reform his ways and try and make up for the wrong that he's done. Right? So here we're showing the possibility of moral regeneration. And strangely enough, that's the same thing we're going to get at the end of Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is explicitly analogized to Lazarus. And the story of Lazarus is not about one guy that rises from the dead. It's about the possibility of spiritual renewal and spiritual regrowth. And that's not unique to the time of Christ. It's possible, not frequent, but possible at anywhere, at any time. So I think both Dostoevsky and the synoptic gospel writers are both giving us images here which gesture at some general fact about human nature, for better and for worse. I mean, if you get a chance to read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, that I think is the most terrifying and desperately frightening novel that I've ever read. If you can imagine a combination of the Brothers Karamazov and Moby Dick and the Iliad, you get some sense of how horrifying it is. And here he seems to have a sort of Calvinistic sense of human depravity. And maybe he's right about that, but I'm not sure that I want to know that. At least in McCarthy's novel, The Road, there's some redemption in the form of the father's love for the son. There's some love there. Whereas Blood Meridian, which is arguably, the greatest novel that he's produced so far, it's uniformly bleak. There's just worse. There's just bad and worse as far as I can see, but I don't see any redemption there. Now, one thing I wanted to mention to you, and you should perhaps think about this. Cormac McCarthy is going to drop 2 new novels, one in mid-October and one in the beginning of December. Because I'm not strong enough, I don't have the health to do another course like this. It takes too much out of me. I'm shot for a day or two afterwards. What I'm going to do is less than a week, the Sunday after these novels drop in October and in December, I'm going to hold an online seminar myself a week so that I could read each book twice. And those that want to kick in some money to support the Ukrainian relief effort, and here I'm not talking about bombs and guns and tanks. I'm talking about providing for the civilians whose lives have been shattered by this. If people will make a contribution of whatever size to Doctors Without Borders, I'm going to teach the Cormac McCarthy novels, insofar as I understand them, because I haven't read them yet. They haven't even published yet. And I've pre-ordered them from Amazon, so I'll get them as soon as they're ready. And we'll get a chance to figure out a novel for which we have essentially no background reading. There's no critical corpus explaining these novels to us. So what I'm going to do in October and then again in early December is talk about the new Cormac McCarthy novels, which I await with some trepidation, because he's such a powerful writer that sometimes I just need to put it down and walk away from it. That's the way I sometimes felt when I was reading Dostoevsky for the first time, right? If you remember in The Brothers Karamazov, the young girl who puts her thumb in a door jamb and slams the door on it intentionally, and then says to herself, bitch, 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 as she watches her purple thumbnail peel off. I'm afraid that there are just some dark corners of the human mind that I shrink from, and I fear that Cormac McCarthy is going to give us some of those. But on the other hand, I think he's a great artist, and I'm going to steel myself and tell myself that even though I may or may not be enjoying this work of art, I'm doing some good, and I'm trying to turn this to a moral purpose. So that's my plan after this class ends in the next, 2 weeks from now. So I'll let you go now. I'm actually feeling kind of tired. I don't have much left, but I will talk to you next week about, The Gay Science. And I translated that book, or at least most of it, about 2/3 of it when I was 23, just because I had nothing better to do. And I will talk to you all then. God bless.
God bless, Professor.
God bless. Thank you.
Bye.